From the campus of the University of Nebraska at Omaha, Consider This with Kathy Wyatt, a program of issues and information behind today's news.
It is now clear that we've achieved the most incredible political thing. Look what happened. Is this crazy?
While I concede this election, I do not concede the fight that fueled this campaign.
Hi everyone, I'm Kathy Wyatt. Welcome to the 28th season and this week's edition of Consider This. Our topic, the presidential transition. Joining us to talk more about it is Randy Adkins, professor of political science at UNO. Thank you so much for being here and welcome back.
Thank you for the invitation. I very much appreciate coming back.
You bet. Okay, polls were close, results were not.
Yeah.
How did Donald Trump win?
Well, if you look at the campaign, what you see is that during the primaries, Donald Trump ran a very disciplined, focused campaign. He put together a great staff. He raised a lot of money. He did exactly what he was supposed to do in the primaries. He got to the convention, and I would say that his campaign up to that point was very tight. And then he came up to a surprise, which was Joe Biden dropped out of the race and Kamala Harris jumped into the race. And from that point on, she did something that was really amazing. In a very, very brief period of time, they transitioned from a Biden campaign staff to a Harris campaign staff. She raised almost $1 billion. So they've got a great organization, they've raised plenty of money, and she tried to find a message that would resonate with voters, and it clearly was resonating with a lot of voters, just not enough voters. Mm-hmm. And both of them, so I would say, ran very, very good campaigns. Trump more so in the primaries, Harris more so in the general election. But what we found coming out of this election is that it wasn't as much about the campaigns that the candidates ran as it was about the fundamentals of the campaign. And by fundamentals, what political scientists mean are two things. Number one, what was Joe Biden's approval rating going into the election? Joe Biden's approval rating was in the low 40s. Now, if you look historically at presidential candidates or presidents who are incumbent presidents, and their approval ratings, when they're in the low 40s, we're talking about people like Gerald Ford, Jimmy Carter, George H.W. Bush, Donald Trump at the end of his first term. And what do those presidents have in common? Either they didn't get reelected or their party didn't get reelected. On the other hand, presidents who have above 50%, so you begin to think about Ronald Reagan in 1984, Bill Clinton, you think about George W. Bush or Barack Obama, they tend to get reelected. So that's one of the fundamentals. The other fundamental is the economy. And while, if you look at certain economic indicators, it suggested that the economy was doing well, for example, unemployment. If you look at other economic indicators like inflation, it suggested that inflation was actually outpacing wage growth. And that was hurting a lot of people, and so the pocketbook issues ended up becoming very important. And again, if we look back and we look at, Jimmy Carter in 1980 with the incredible high inflation and high unemployment, George W. Bush in the recession in 1992, we see that presidents who are sort of, burdened by that economic situation often have trouble getting reelected. In this case, Kamala Harris had to deal with both of those things at the same time. So basically what we find is voters and consumers were essentially unhappy with the Democratic Party, and as a result, she ended up not winning.
Randy, we just put up the map here. Is there anything that you want to speak directly to that our viewers might be interested in?
Well, I think probably the most important thing just to note is that out of those battleground states that were all very close in the polls, Donald Trump ended up sweeping them. The one place that he didn't win was Nebraska too, which was considered to be a battleground as well over one electoral college vote. I think a lot of people were surprised about that, but in retrospect, knowing those fundamentals of the campaign that we just talked about, I think this is probably what we should have expected.
Okay, all right. Well, winning non-consecutive terms has only happened once before.
Yeah.
What can you tell us about Grover Cleveland, the circumstances surrounding his third bid, and how he managed to win?
Yeah, so Grover Cleveland was the 22nd and 24th president of the United States. He was a former mayor of Buffalo, and he was the governor of New York, and he was a Democrat. And he ended up winning in 1884, running on a platform as a reformer, very much like Teddy Roosevelt was a reformer later on. He ended up winning the South, which was controlled by the Democratic Party at the time, but he brought along with that New York, which was worth 36 electoral college votes. And so he ended up not only winning the popular vote, but he ended up winning the electoral college vote in 1884. And he was the first Democrat who was elected since prior to the Civil War when Buchanan had won. Now in 1888, he ends up winning the popular vote, but not the electoral college vote because his opponent, Benjamin Harrison, is from Indiana, which at the time was one of the bigger states, and so it carried 15 electoral college votes. And Harrison was able to actually pry away Cleveland's home state of New York from him. And so he ended up winning an electoral college victory. Basically, if Cleveland had been able to win his own state in 1888, his home state, he would have ended up winning the election. Now what happens in 1892 is that we have to keep in mind that at that particular point in time, or important point in history, elections are primaries don't exist. You know, this is before the days of primaries. And candidates for the nomination are chosen by conventions, which means they're chosen by the party leaders, the bosses, the elders. So there's not a grueling primary season that's going to take months and months and months. And so Cleveland simply had to go to the convention and convince more Democratic leaders that he was the best candidate. And of course, voters at that particular time were tired of Harrison's policies, and so they ended up supporting Cleveland. The really sad thing for Cleveland is there was a huge depression in 1893, and so he ended up finishing out his last 3 years in a very difficult economic time for the country.
Wow. Okay, back here to present day now, talking about voters and turnout. Got close to the record-breaking turnout, but didn't quite get there. What happened? Yeah,
so we had 65% turnout of eligible voters. So that means people who are over the age of 18 within the United States. That is the second highest turnout since 1908 in comparison to the highest turnout, which was in 2020. Now, the thing I think we have to keep in mind is that in 2020, we got 67%, so it's a couple percent more, but it's the height of the pandemic in 2020. And there were a lot of people who were low propensity voters that year who turned out to vote for Joe Biden, not really as a vote for Joe Biden, but more as a vote against Donald Trump. A lot of those voters don't seem to have turned out this year. And so that's why when we look at the overall numbers on the Democratic side, there seems to be a drop in the number of Democratic voters relative to Donald Trump, who got about the same number of voters that he got in the last election cycle. The other thing I would mention is that states have tightened identification laws, voter identification laws. And so that probably has, you know, not a major difference, but that probably has kept some voters from going to the polls because they may not have a current ID. Okay, all right. Well, up to this point, he has defeated 2 female candidates. So I have to ask, when do you think this country is going to elect a female president? Yeah, I think it's going to be sooner than we think. So, I mean, I know that a lot of people are looking at this right now and saying, you know, 2016 he defeated Hillary Clinton and look how qualified she was, and he just defeated, you know, Donald Trump just defeated Kamala Harris and look how qualified she was. But I think in those particular instances, what we have to look at is, in 2016, there was a lot of fatigue that went along with the Clinton name. That wasn't necessarily Hillary Clinton's fault. That comes from the fact that her husband was a previous president. And we also were just on the end of this sort of Bush fatigue that was going on as well. And so I think a lot of people wanted to turn over and sort of turn a new leaf. So you've got that going on. And then with Harris, I think she just had a really difficult time separating herself from Biden. There just wasn't enough time to do it. So she couldn't really run on her own platform. She had to sort of run on the Biden platform. You know, she's asked in that interview on The View, what would you do differently in the last 3.5 years? And she couldn't name anything. Part of that's out of loyalty to the president, but part of that is because, you know, they just haven't had the time during the primaries to sort of game that out. What I would mention, though, is I think that there's a couple of Democrats that everybody should be watching for. So one is Gretchen Whitmer from Michigan. So she's going to be a contender in 2028. And then the other one is going to be Michelle Grisham of New Mexico. She's not very well known right now, but she's a very popular governor in New Mexico. And don't forget, Harris could come back and run as well. So that's always a possibility. And on the Republican side, there's Nikki Haley, and then I would also mention Sarah Huckabee Sanders is another possibility as a governor. Wow. Okay, so walking away from this, and I know we've all seen various interviews, but in your opinion, what did the Democrats learn
coming out of this?
Yeah, well, what they need to learn, I'm not going to say they've learned it yet, but they need to get back to what one would call kitchen table issues. You know, they really just have to get back to what James Carville said in 1992 when he was running the Clinton campaign. They had a little haiku on a whiteboard in their war room where all their campaign officials worked. And one of the lines in that said, "It's the economy, stupid." You know, it's always about the economy, and you have to focus like a laser beam on the economy, because if the economy is not good, voters are going to vote on that. You know, it's going to be very, very important to them. The other thing I would recommend to Democrats is pay attention to those 4 Senate races in battleground states where the Senate candidates, the Democratic Senate candidates, actually won while Kamala Harris lost. And so I'm talking about Nevada, Arizona, Wisconsin, and Michigan. And look at what those candidates did. They were all able to run on their accomplishments. And I think that's what voters want to hear. They want to hear, what have you done previously? You know, they want to know what your experience is, and I think that's very important.
I did want to ask you specifically about the Trump supporters, those people who did vote for him.
Yeah.
I know you, among many people, have looked at exit polls. And before we drill down and talk about a little bit more about the economy and so forth, who were those people that voted for him? Yeah,
so in comparison to 2020, what we found was that Trump made huge gains with Latino men. He was up 35% with Latino men. He was up 17% with Latino women. That's a group that Republicans have never done really well with, and so he did very well. The other thing is, Republicans have done real well with rural voters, but he actually gained 15 points with rural voters, and a lot of people haven't talked about that. And surprisingly, while he didn't win young voters, 18 to 29, he gained 13 points over where he was in the previous election cycle. Harris, on the other hand, gained 7 points with white college-educated women. Okay, I mean, that's important, but 7 points is not 35 points, okay? And she gained 5 points with people 65 and older. But overall, Trump gained basically in all categories.
Wow.
At least a little bit.
Okay, we're going to talk a little bit more about, because of course all eyes are on him now, the economy, illegal immigration, and then foreign policy. Before we do that, though, I do want to talk about this Presidential Transition Act. There are documents that need to be signed that apparently his team is not wanting to sign. So I wanted to ask you more about this act and why it's so important.
Yeah, so the Presidential Transition Act has been around since 1963, so it's not anything new. It has been amended a number of times. It was actually amended in 2020 and 2022, so it's regularly revisited by the Congress, and it's signed by the President. In fact, the 2020 amendment was signed by President Trump. The part that the Trump campaign is concerned about is that in the paperwork for that transition is an ethics pledge. And part of that ethics pledge deals with avoiding conflicts of interest. And as we know, the Trump family has a whole array of businesses that they're very concerned about, having to sort of give up or to lose contact with. And so they're realizing that maybe there could be a conflict of interest. I want to be really careful about signing this. There's a negotiation that's going on with that currently. Now, how that lack of signature affects the Trump transition is that his team is not eligible for briefings yet. And so there's some very important briefings that they need to be getting. I anticipate that will be resolved. I won't say soon, but I think it will be resolved at some point.
Okay, all right. Number one, the economy, talk of tariffs. Good or bad, Randy?
Well, I think talk about economists. Economists will say on the one hand this, but on the other hand that. So Harry Truman said what you always needed was a good one-handed economist. Because they would have two different opinions for you. Let's just first of all understand what a tariff is. A tariff is a surcharge on a good or a product that comes in from another country, and we do that to try to reduce trade deficits that we have with other countries. Okay, so one of the things that Donald Trump has been very concerned about are trade deficits. He was concerned about this in his first administration, and so he placed tariffs on a number of Chinese products. For example, and as a specific example, he placed tariffs on washing machines that depending on whether it was a washing machine or whether it was a part could vary between 20 and 50% related to the cost of it. He's talked about doing this again, not just with China, but with many countries, possibly across the board, and that would include many of our allies. I don't think Trump intends it as a tax, but the problem is that when you have something like tariffs in the short term, before we can figure out, producers can figure out new ways to produce those goods that might be here in the United States or in countries that are not facing those tariffs. But before you can do that, it's going to reduce the buying power of Americans. And so that's why it's going to feel like a tax. It's not literally a tax, but it's going to feel like a tax. I want to point out that this could be particularly troublesome for states in the Midwest because we're agriculture producers. And there could be, if we place tariffs on Chinese manufactured goods, they might place tariffs on agricultural goods that we sell to them. And so, you could be thinking about corn, wheat, barley, other agricultural goods that are sold overseas. We could end up with tariffs placed on those. That would probably hurt farmers.
Wow. Okay. All right. We're going to move on to illegal immigration and this mass deportation.
Yeah.
So I have to ask, is that possible? And if it is, how could that shake out?
Yeah. So let me just mention that we have done something like this before. If we go back to the 1950s and the Eisenhower administration, there was an operation called Operation Wetback. I'm sorry to use that term. That's literally what the name of the program was, and it was about 1.3 million individuals were deported and sent back to Mexico. So historically, we have done something like this before. Okay, not on the scale that Trump has talked about. Now he has said that we would first target criminals, and there probably are some criminal elements that have been able to enter the U.S., and this would be a reason to go after them. The problem is that Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, is not really right now staffed up to do something like this. And so it's going to take a little while for them to get staffed up, and probably we're going to need an increase in their budget in order to do something like this. So it's not something I think the president can do, when he hits the ground on the first day in the Oval Office. It's probably going to take a little while. But he has appointed Tom Homan, who was the ICE director in the previous administration, in his previous administration, to be his border czar. So he clearly the President-elect clearly considers this to be very important, and I think it's something he's going to aggressively pursue.
Wow. Okay. All right. And finally, the America First approach to foreign policy running list of appointees.
Yeah.
Right. So, talk to us. Maybe you can drop some names here, or just in broad strokes, what's important for us to know about this list so far?
Yeah, well, let's go a little broad first, because I think there's really sort of two rounds of people in this list so far. The first round of people are the people that I would consider they're like heavyweight contenders. Okay, Susie Wiles is going to be his chief of staff. She ran his campaign, and as I said a few minutes ago, it was a very disciplined campaign. She was able to manage him in a way that other people have not been able to manage him, to keep him on his targets for what he had to say and what he had to do. I expect that she's probably going to be very helpful to him in the White House. Marco Rubio at the State Department, a long-term member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, senator from the state of Florida. Elise Stefanik for UN ambassador. I think that she really showed her chops, so to speak, in those hearings last year that people saw on television, where she questioned some of the presidents of the Ivy League schools about what was going on in Israel and Gaza, and then Mike Walls for National Security Advisor, and John Ratcliffe for CIA, who's his former Director of National Intelligence. These are sort of the kinds of people we expected to see in that first round. Okay. Now, the second round's a little bit different. He's gone a different direction in the second round. And these are individuals who are probably less experienced, some of them less experienced in the area that they've been asked to work in, but they're very loyal to Trump. Okay, so you think about Kristi Noem, the governor of South Dakota, is going to be she's been put up to be the Homeland Security Secretary. Lee Zeldin, who's supposed to be, in charge of the Environmental Protection Agency. He's not considered to be an environmentalist. Pete Hegseth, the Fox News personality, for Secretary of Defense. Tulsi Gabbard, who used to be a Democrat, as Director of National Intelligence, and then just yesterday, Matt Gaetz for Attorney General, and I think I just saw on a news scroll on the way over here that Robert F. Kennedy Jr. would be nominated to lead Health and Human Services. Here's the thing about this group of people. They're all really good on television. And so many of them, you think about Hegseth, he's actually a television personality. And so I think Trump is looking for people who can defend himself and defend his agenda on television. And so it'll be interesting to see then who he appoints at the next level, and to see if those tend to be the people who are more like the managers.
Well, and that second level is being loyal to Trump and good on TV. Is that enough for these people not to have backgrounds in some of these areas, or how are you feeling about that piece of it?
Well, it's for example, with Hegseth, the Defense Department is there's 3 million employees in the Defense Department, between defense and contractors and people who are civilians, whatever. That's a big organization. It's like taking over Walmart. So it's a pretty big organization, and he's run a nonprofit. So it's we'll see how he does. Okay. And we'll also see what happens when the Senate takes up their ratifications, because I'm sure the Senate's going to ask some very serious questions, about these individuals, their qualifications, what they plan to do, how they would handle certain decisions, and that's the Senate's role and responsibility.
Okay, all right, and I do want to ask you about the Senate Republicans.
Yeah.
So he's demanding that they allow these recess appointments. I wanted to ask you first, what are those, and why is this issue so important? So in the Constitution, the president is allowed to make appointments to the cabinet and to other positions with the advice and consent of the Senate. Okay, so that means, the Senate can give their advice, but a majority of them have to approve of it. The recess appointments at the founding occurred because Congress was only in session like 2 or 3 months a year. And if they're only in session 2 or 3 months a year, they might be out of session for long periods of time. And the president might have to make an emergency appointment because the government had to keep functioning. So that is provided for in the Constitution. Presidents have continued to do this. I want to say Bush and Clinton each made plus or minus 150 recess appointments while they were president. But what typically happens is that when they make a recess appointment, soon after, the Senate will take that up, or within a period of time. But in the Obama administration, Obama had gotten to about 30 recess appointments, and McConnell, who was the Senate leader at the time, the Senate Republican leader at the time, he said enough. We're not going to do any more recess appointments. So there were no more recess appointments in the Obama administration, in the Trump administration, or in the Biden administration. So what Donald Trump is trying to do is he's trying to return to recess appointments that presidents were permitted to have previously. The question has come up as to whether he would try to push through somebody at a high level, like say a Matt Gaetz as Attorney General, using a recess appointment, because the president also has the ability to convene and adjourn Congress. So he could send them home for a couple days of recess and make a recess appointment during that time. Interesting. Okay.
So we don't know that. That's a real constitutional question that's going to come up.
Okay. We have about 4 minutes left, Brandy. And I wanted to ask about Liz Cheney and some other folks there in that first go-around with Trump, who were highly critical. What do you anticipate is going to happen here in this second go-around? Yeah,
so as we know, Donald Trump doesn't follow sort of the norms and conventions of things. He does things his own way. He does things a little bit differently. He didn't come to government with a lot of experience, but now he has the experience under his belt of governing for a term and sort of finding his own way. And so he's going to chart his own path, and he's going to continue to do that. He prefers to act unilaterally. So when Democrats were critical of him, they called it authoritarian style. He prefers to act without that sort of separation of power that you see when you have the president and Congress. And the question is, as he makes decisions doing this, it's going to be up to the Congress and the courts to decide whether they need to check him. And so if they abdicate that responsibility, which Congress and the courts have done that before, then that gives the president more power. The question is, will they do it now?
Okay, we have a couple minutes remaining. Final thoughts on this transition?
Yeah, well, it's probably going to be an unprecedented transition. Of course, the last transition was also unprecedented too, because there wasn't cooperation between the sitting government and the incoming government. We like to think that we can create policies and we can create rules and we can have norms and we can follow them, but sometimes somebody comes along who just does something different, and the voters have decided to pick someone who just does things differently. And so, and when I say the voters have picked him, I mean a majority of voters in the United States voted for Donald Trump. We're going to have to let him lead, but that does not mean that the Congress, the courts, the parties, the states cannot provide checks on that leadership if they feel he has overstepped his bounds. Okay,
we have about a minute. The Electoral College, moving forward, is this really the best way?
Unfortunately, it's the only way. In order to change the Electoral College, we would have to change the Constitution. We're not going to change the Constitution. Now, states do have the ability to change the way that they allocate their electors. As we know, Maine and Nebraska does it a little differently. We don't use the winner-take-all plan. We use the district plan. It is possible that other states could adopt that. I don't think it'll happen, though. I think what's more likely is in Nebraska, we're probably going to ask ourselves the question of whether we want to continue to do it. And so we'll have to wait and see what happens.
Interesting. Talking with Randy Adkins today about the presidential transition. I want to thank you for coming back and for being available to us so that we can talk with you about all this stuff, sharing your time and expertise.
You're welcome.
We'll keep our eye on things moving forward.
Yes.
Thank you, Randy. Thanks to our students who are working so hard behind the scenes, and of course to all of you for watching. We'll see you next week.
Consider This is an issues and information program produced by UNO Television in the School of Communication. More information and program archives can be found at nebraskapublicmedia.org/considerthis. If you'd like to share your comments about this program, call the UNO School of Communication at 402-554-2600 during regular business hours. Or send an email to cwyatt@unomaha.edu.
There seems to be like this gathering right here of really great minds and really great ideas.
I think it's a great moment, to teach a UNO student.
Being here, I get like a jump start on my journalism career.
I found a lot of people that are interested in like the same things as me.
Sort of a lifetime changing career for me, and the best way it could happen.